the panelists Giovanni Gozzini, Ettore Recchi, and Guy Godwin Will to come to the table. Thank you. Okay, so thank you all for coming today. So we meet once again since yesterday. I hope you had a lovely evening yesterday at the restaurant. Unfortunately, Professor Cataldi will be a little bit late. He excused himself, but he will come in a minute. So let me open the first session. Good morning. My name is Anna Nikodinowska-Krstevska. As I presented myself yesterday, I come from the University Goce Deljev Stip in North Macedonia. And today I will be the chair of the first session, Migrants and Asylum Seekers in the General Framework. So I will briefly introduce our three guests today, who will be the first three panelists of this meeting. So the first panelist will be Giovanni Gozzini from the University of Siena. Professor Gozzini is a full professor of contemporary history at the Department of Social, Political and Knowledge Science. He was a visiting professor at the Mount Scopus University in Jerusalem, Israel, and at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University. Professor Ettore Recchi from the University Sciences Po in Paris is a professor of sociology, and he is an affiliated part-time professor with the Migration Policy Center of the European University Institute in Florence. But he has also taught and done research at the University of Florence, the University of Chieti Pescara, University of Michigan, Gonzaga University, University of Complutense Carlos III from Madrid, and the Warsaw School of Social Psychology. And the third speaker of the first, let's say, part of the first session is Guy Godwin Will from the All Souls College of the University of Oxford and the University of New South Wales. Is an honorary professor since 2022 and emeritus fellow since 2014, teaching international refugee law. In February 2020, he was awarded the Stefan Reinsfield, I think, Memorial Award at the Berkeley Law for his contribution to international law and international refugee law. So I will give the floor now to Professor Giovanni Gozzini, yes, from the University of Siena. Today he will be speaking, he will be presenting on the topic, where are the migrants coming from, globalization and inequalities over the last 50 years. And sorry, Professor Gozzini, before giving the floor, just to acknowledge the speakers, I have received very strict rules from Professor Cataldi regarding the time frame of the intervention. So you should try to give your presentation. No, within 20 minutes, we have 1 minute of tolerance.
I will try 15.
Okay, thank you very much. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. I will try to take the questions raised yesterday by Professor Hathaway from a different perspective, I hope complementary perspective. That's to locate the question of refugees within the general framework of international migrations. My first point is this map. I hope we may depict. Okay. This is the outcome of the last 30 years of scientific research in the field of historical genetics. The same strain of DNA has been extracted by the skeletons of our ancient ancestors in the prehistorical times, following the red line you see in the map, according to the chronological sequence you may see. Migration belongs to the original imprinting of the human beings. They were hunters and gatherers, so they exhausted the natural resources which were present in the limited environment they lived in, and when the resources were exhausted, they had to move. They had no furniture, so moving was easy and natural. And they settled all over the world. the same strain of DNA, until the so-called Neolithic Revolution, approximately 5,000 years before Christ, when men and women invented the agriculture. And the consequence was the establishment of borders, institutions, armies, and wars. That point is particularly important considering the migration not as an emergency, but as an historical constant of the human activity. This graph depicts the current situation, the last century of international migrations. You may see the black continuous line, that's the percentage out of the world population of the stock of foreign-born population, people who live in a country different from the country where they were born. And you may see that's a constant. The only uphill trend is only an artificial administrative transformation, this dissolution of Soviet Union in 1991. At that time, 27 millions of former Soviet citizens, Russians, sent by Stalin during the 1930s to populate other Soviet republics, they automatically become migrants. But it's an artificial. So the percentage is, as you may see, between 2 and 3%. It didn't increase. That's a constant. And this circumstance is particularly striking if you consider that global inequalities have dramatically increased during the same span of time. I mean some little data. Un bracciante, that's a land laborer of Sicily, at the beginning of the 20th century, was aspiring to a mean wage in the United States or in Brazil or in Argentina, the Americas, 3 times higher. Now, on average, an electronic engineer in India can aspire to a mean wage that's 26 times higher in the United States. So inequalities are dramatically increasing, but notwithstanding the percentage of migrants remains stable, flat. But one thing is percentage, that's a statistical abstraction. One thing is the critical mass. And you have to consider that another historical constant is the settlement of immigrants into clusters. Little Italy, Chinatown, that's another historical constant, and that's the problem. We have a critical mass of individuals who provoke the reaction of the hosting population. That's the focus of the social conflict connected with the international migration and of the issues more or less artificially raised by xenophobic right-wing parties, extreme right-wing parties. This is the detail for the United States. That's nowadays, just like 1 century ago, the most important attractor of economic migrants. You know, the policies adopted by the European Union are founded upon the distinction between economic migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. I am convinced that this kind of difference is somewhat obsolete. We have a lot of cases of an overlapping between the two conditions within the same person, within the same individual. A refugee who lives in a refugee camp in Turkey, and year after year, he or she sees the children are not attending school, he becomes economic migrants, trying to seek the access to the European Union. And he or she is obliged to enter in contact with a novelty, a new, from an historical point of view, that's the criminal organization connected with the smuggling or the trafficking of migrants. And it's the problem we have, a new problem from an historical point of view. This is the map of the most important corridors. Maybe one novelty is the Persian Gulf countries. They are attracting people especially from India and Southeast Asia. And this is a paradoxical situation because the immigrants in Saudi Arabia have the very high working rights, and they are no citizens. They are denizens. The neologism has been coined because outside of the compound of their private firm, they are nobody. They have no rights at all. These are the corridors. I have stressed the importance of Russian Federation and Ukraine before the war. There is a clear and very strong and very historically constant flow of population, two ways flow between Russia and so it pushes us to consider how paradoxical is this war from a people point of view. How much is the percentage of refugees and internally displaced persons, IDP, that you know is one of the kind of policies adopted by the United Nations for the situations of armed conflict, is more or less flat, about 10%. So refugees are a little component of economic international migrations, with the problem I was raising just a moment before, this overlapping between the two conditions. Notwithstanding the increasing, and dramatically increasing, and you see from the graph, of the number of refugees. What is the cause of this increasing amount of refugees? Not the number of war, the black continuous line, but their changing character. This is the book has been the opportunity for us historians to change our mind about contemporary armed conflicts. Mary Caldor was a colleague in Leeds University at that time, and I was in the London School of Economics. She was an official observer of the United Nations in the Balkan War in the 1990s. That experience on the field was the origin of this book. What are the new wars? The 5 characters, basic characters I have listed there. Collapse of the state, Yugoslavia. You can apply this kind of prototype to Libya, to Syria, to Yemen, to a lot of conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa nowadays. The proliferation of paramilitary bands. In some cases, they are former supporters of football team. The Azov battalion in Ukraine were the supporters of the Dynamo of Kiev. The famous Tigers of Arkan in the Balkans world were the supporters of the Red Star, the most important football team of Belgrade. Paramilitary bands extract resources from the civilian population. Food, shelter, fuel, and protection. The phenomenon of baby soldiers is connected to this. They are not soldiers. They are the kidnapped baby to keep into ransom their originary families, their originary villages. And so paramilitary bands are not interested in peace process. They have all to lose from a peace process, and the consequence is that the new wars are endemic wars, prolonging time over time, and with a lot of difficulty to peacekeeping and peace enforcing missions eventually possibly adopted by the United Nations. 83 paramilitary bands only for Serbians and so on. So the numbers are really significant. Refugees are the consequence of this changing nature of contemporary armed conflicts. I think that these changes are irreversible. I don't think that the trend of proliferation and disintegration of violence will stop. It will increase. And so the number of refugees is doomed to increase. My final point, Ukraine war. For some aspects, it is a return of an old war. Armies regularly displayed and on the field. They have no the ancient historical symbols, different colors of the uniforms. The uniforms are the same. They have to endorse some very, very rude recognized signs. But anyway, the shape of armed conflict adopted by Ukraine resembles a guerrilla, little armed units with light anti-tank weapons, no aviation, no military aviation, that's a novelty, and a dispersed nature of the conflict without a clear front line dividing the armies. So there are old characters and new characters. In my humble opinion, the favor which was tributed to the Ukrainian refugees is not only, in my humble opinion, not predominantly the feeling of similarity of religion, of culture. I think that these old, what science in this case war, can recognize very clearly and very unequivocally who is the aggressor and who is the invaded people. So the sympathy is a political sympathy, in my humble opinion. This kind of recognition is quite more difficult in the new wars. Who has the right? Who are the refugees of Syrian Republic? Are they connected with the Daesh, with ISIS, or no? Who is the enemy? Who is the aggressor? It's much more difficult to recognize. And so that's a further difficulty we have to manage the problem of the refugees. But anyway, my final message is the numbers are not so striking. We can manage them. With a further problem, this map represents, as you may see, the conflicts, the red areas of refugees produced by armed conflicts. We have a new emergency, you know very well that point, the refugees produced by climatic disaster. And while armed conflicts are local, climate emergency is global. And so you may see that the number of crisis situations can spread and multiply almost all over the tropical area of our planet. So we can manage, the problem is not easy, but we have to assume an attitude of management of international migration. When I say management, I say not only the problem of emergency at the border, but you have to regulate the flow from the starting point until the arrival point. Maybe, that's really the final point, we may change our agenda in order to exercise a kind of hegemony over the right-wing xenophobic parties, assuming as a priority the struggle against criminal organization. If you assume at this point, the consequence, it seems to me necessary consequence, is to manage the flow from the start until the end of the movement of people. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Gozzini, for your wonderful speech regarding the different perspectives of migration, both through historical point of view and from the social point of view, and of course the changing character of migration and how migration should be approached from the beginning to the end. We really enjoyed it. Thank you, and thank you for sticking to the time frame. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Ettore Recchi from the University Sciences Po of Paris. And he will speak, he will deliver a presentation on states as gatekeepers, lessons from macro-empirical research on visas and borders globally. So, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks to the organizers, to Professor Cataldi for inviting me. I'm bringing to this conference somewhat different perspective. I'm a sociologist with some sort of interdisciplinary background and interest, and I will present some findings from my recent research on two of the main tools by which international migration and population movements are regulated, that is, border management and visas. I have a broad interest on the mobility of human beings worldwide, which is a larger topic than just international migration. And we speak about international migration because our world, the world we live in, is divided into nations. And nations have a key feature in the fact of having borders and controlling who they want to get in or get through these borders and who is unwanted. This management of entry rights is a core, is a hallmark of the stateness of modern states. But this creates a divide in the world because between those people who are accepted, who can move, who don't need visas, who just capitalize on the power of the passports, and people who in fact are excluded from these right. We may simplify this and say it's a rich versus the poor world, but things are more complicated than this. And I'm going to show you why in a minute. So basically my presentation is divided into two parts. a part which presents recent research on borders that have been carried out with colleagues, particularly the Migration Policy Center of a European University Institute, and research I've made on the cost of visas. Borders first. The study of borders is quite widespread from different angles. There is a social legal perspective, which is well represented in this room. There is an eminent scholar of the issue just in front of me. There is a more culturalist take on it, how borders are constructed not only on physical geographical borders, but also within states. And there is a more realistic perspective that studies, in political science and international relations, border fortification. I have a slightly different take, which is a sort of CB or C2. I'm interested in the nature of land borders, but I'm not only interested in walls and fortification. But before getting into my findings, let me just show you this historical graph, which in a sense echoes the historical perspective given by my colleague Giovanni Gozzini. We live in an era of walls. If you look at the number of fortified borders worldwide, this has been escalating basically since the end of the Cold War. And now about 20% of global borders have some fortification dividing one state from the other, which is totally unprecedented. We have examples here, but let's skip them. You're very familiar with all of them. My perspective is, rather than studying walls or barbed wires, I think it's more interesting if you want to have a better grasp of the possibilities or ease of mobility of people around the globe, including asylum seekers, to study the infrastructure that crosses borders. Yes, walls can prevent movements, but in fact movements need roads, need railways, need bridges or ferries to occur across borders. And so what we engage into over the past few years has been to meticulously and systematically record all roads, all railways, all bridges, all ferries, and all checkpoints that exist along all the 315 land borders dividing states on this planet. We have 6 different situations which we are confronted with. The situation in the panel A is the easiest possible situation. There is no crossing. Actually, the border is maybe follows a mountain line, and yes, you can cross it, but you have to climb, and there is no established path. So it's almost watertight or impermeable border. The situation B is there is a road. So there are not many possibilities, but there is one possibility. Then you have C, there are many roads. D, roads and railways. E, where you have roads, railways, bridges, but also have some checkpoints, so some passages are easier than others. And F, in which all possible passages are barred by a checkpoint. Trying to systematize these, we built a border permeability index, which is a very simple, this is not rocket science. We just count the number of border crossing infrastructures, the roads, the railways, the paths, the bridges, minus the number of checkpoints, C, multiplied by the level of enforcement checkpoints, this factor E, divided by the length in kilometers of the borders, and then with a standardization factor. And this way we have, for every single border on the planet, a coefficient that tells us how porous, how easy it is to cross that land border. Our data come from open access maps, OpenStreetMap, the Harvard World Map, and we also use the World Food Program maps as regards checkpoints in Africa, which is one of the hardest things we could get our access to. And we count the number and type of border crossing infrastructure every 500 meters of a borderline, which means that if there are two roads in a 500-meter clusters, we just count one, okay? So the index, in a sense, can tell us how many accesses or free accesses there are every 500 meters of a borderline. We started the process automatically. We have a data scientist on board, Lorenzo Gabrielli from CNR in Pisa, and he don't ask me too much about the technicalities because I defer to him on these, but basically he standardized or kind of smoothed the lines of the borders and then took the lines of the roads and matched them, and so if the matching worked or not. And the same technique was applied to checkpoints. A long story short, we did manual checkings of these, and soon we found out that computers make mistakes. So we repeated the process manually, and believe me, this was long because we had to go visually all over the land borders, and we found out that 25% of a computer-generated matching was wrong, either because the computer falsely attributed some roads as crossing, but they didn't cross, they stopped at the border, or in fact did not see some possible passages, for instance ferries, which we coded manually. But at the end of the day, we have a data set with 30,000 border crossings of different types, and 2,500 checkpoints. I go to the results. The higher the index, the higher the permeability of the border. And it's possibly no surprise then in an area which is predominantly marked by free movement rights and Schengen system, the border permeability index is higher. So Europe is by far the area where borders are most permeable worldwide. It might be surprising that second comes Africa. And then farther below you have Asia, Latin America, and North America. I skip some details. The two different graphs that you see adjust for different levels of enforcement of the checkpoints. I can discuss this if you want further on. A point that I want to highlight is checkpoints are more frequent in North America and in Europe than elsewhere on Earth. So this is the ranking of the most permeable world borders. Again, we have two different rankings depending on whether we consider checkpoint enforcement at the weakest level, so the parameter E is 0, or at the highest level the parameter is 1, which means that the cross-border access is de facto bad. The results are not very different. And we see that on top we have within Europe, intra-European borders, and especially borders between small states. There are some African borders which are particularly open and porous. The real surprise is the border between Palestine and Israel, which is relatively permeable if we keep the coefficient low, the coefficient of enforcement or checkpoints, which is the case. Actually, we know from the literature in normal times. It's not too difficult to cross the border when the situation is relatively calm. And so there are plenty of border crossings. The issue is that when the situation becomes tense, these checkpoints become strongly enforced, and even flying additional checkpoints are introduced at that particular border. And here you have the least permeable world borders. We have South Africa and Zimbabwe, we have United States and Mexico, we have Turkey and Greece. So some of these borders are very hot borders. I'm going to conclude on these with a more sophisticated analysis, trying to explain why some borders are, what makes some borders more permeable than others. And we consider 4 families of factors: economic factors, political factors, mobility and population factors, and cultural factors. I have to present the regression models that take these factors in account and weight these factors one against the other. I'll walk you through these equations, these models. Basically, what we find is that there is a curvilinear effect of economic development. Borders are permeable when countries are either very poor or very rich. Okay, very poor because they cannot afford to have roads or to have checkpoints. Very rich because they want to have border crossings. Border crossings means trades, means possibility of further development. Not surprisingly, borders are less permeable when there is inequality. Inequality between 2 countries makes borders more tight. Then we have a strong significant effect of population density in the 2 countries, which means that in some sense populations exert some pressure on opening the borders. But the existence of strong mobility links and is not a factor, and cultural factor have no effect, and political factors in the full model, that is whether the countries are democratic, whether they have joint membership in international government organization, that has no effect. The most striking result to me is socioeconomic development and the importance of socioeconomic development for shaping the type of borders that we find. Second part, visas. Again, I don't need to tell to this audience how important are visas as remote state controls on access to countries. As for visas, and particularly tourist visas, states have a dilemma. On the one hand, tourist visas can be seen as a threat because they allow people to get in and possibly to overstay their visas, unwanted travelers. But on the other hand, tourism brings wealth, and the tourist industry is the largest industry worldwide, at least before the pandemic, and it makes up 10% of the world GDP and employs 12% of the global workforce. Visa waivers have been on the increase after the Second World War. They spread a lot in the 50s and 60s. They declined in the 1970s. They quite reintroduced after the 1980s. but existing research shows that visa waivers, that is lifting visa for citizens of certain countries, has become more widespread among citizens of OECD countries, rich countries, and was in fact diminished progressively to people from less developed countries. You can see three situations: the number of visa waivers in 1969, not many in general. In 2010, there was already a polarization. A number of countries had, let's say, half of the countries worldwide had less than 40 countries to which they could have access to without a visa. And the other half is countries or citizens of countries that have passports that give free access to more than 40 other countries. And this polarization has been further exacerbated in 2020. You see there is a bimodal distribution on the right-hand side graph. Now, my colleagues and I have built a new data set in 2019, retrieving data not only on visa waivers, such a data set existed, but also on the cost of visas. Because one instrument, one tool to encourage or discourage people to travel or to apply for a visa is the cost the governments put on the visa. The data set is freely available and downloadable from the Migration Policy Center data set. It's also available on the Harvard repository. Okay, I have to speed up. So I have to select among my many graphs. This is a hierarchy of visas, the visas that are cheaper and the visas that are more costly. Work visas are the costliest visas, and transit visas are the cheapest. This is possibly the most important graph, which shows a paradox. The richer you are, the cheaper the visa you may want to apply is going to be. We call this the Matthew effect in visa cost. And the Catholics in the room may know what I'm referring to. It's a gospel. Where you live matters to move. So if you live in Western Europe, on average, the visa you may apply to will cost you about $15. But if you live in India or in Southern Asia, on average, you need to pay $53. And we standardize these in average days of work to buy a visa. Basically, if you live in the US, in Canada, and in Western Europe, 1 hour of work is sufficient to buy you a visa. If you live in sub-Saharan Africa, you need to work 25 to 70 days, okay, to buy an application for a visa. It's an application, not even a visa. So I'm going to conclude. Borders are harder or easier to cross, and why they're harder or easier much depends on the level of development of the countries on the two sides of the border. Visas are, let's say, a manifestation of inequalities in the world, and citizens of the Global South are twice penalized by visas because they have to apply to visas to go possibly to a larger number of countries than citizens of the Global North. But when they apply, they also have to invest much more money than citizens of rich countries. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I'm happy to answer your questions further on.
Thank you, Professor Ricci, for your really interesting presentation and the research that you have developed in borders, visas, and the border permeability index. It was really interesting to see, which is the inequality, to affirm it once again between the rich and poor countries. So now I would like to give the floor to Professor Guy Goodwin Gill. He will, from the All Souls College at the University of Oxford and the University of New South Wales in Sydney. He will deliver a presentation on the challenge to protect the refugee in international law. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back in Naples. When I last spoke here in May 2015, the so-called crisis of refugee movements was getting underway. And today it is eclipsed by the plight of Ukrainians, over 6 million of whom have now fled their country because of the Russian invasion. Nor can the plight of Ukrainians refugees be considered any less dire than that of Syrians, Afghans, or Iraqis, although their reception, faute de mieux, initially proved easier, and the call for protection was heeded time and again, although with some worrisome exceptions. In 2015, however, competing forces were at work. Italy had acted as the conscience of Europe, rescuing many tens of thousands at sea, but without the material and moral support of partners in the European Union. What was clearly needed if protection was to succeed was a scheme of effective, equitable sharing of responsibilities among a community committed in principle to common fundamental principles. I argued then for a European Migration and Protection Agency to monitor solutions in light of obligations. And I argued further that Europe, particularly the European Union, had special responsibilities given its assertion of an entitlement to monitor the movement of people across the Mediterranean. That responsibility and the complex of protection obligations that go with it arose because of a combination of context, circumstance, knowledge, and engagement. The legal interests of states of origin, transit, and intended or actual destination are all engaged, and only a rights-based strategy was or is likely to have any impact. However, it was not to be. And in the years after 2016, the European Union and its neighbours proved to be a congeries of dislocated, dysfunctional sovereign states. In Greece, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, Croatia, Serbia, and Belarus, among others, official approval was given to pushbacks, to assaults, to abandonment, to denial of access, and denial of disembarkation, in order apparently to send a message to the refugee and to asylum seekers: you are not welcome. And still they came. A report published last month by the NGO group Mare Liberum presents a catalogue of the individualized violence inherent in pushbacks. Indeed, it's difficult to imagine a pushback that does not involve violence or the threat of force. In the Aegean and at land borders, pushbacks have become the norm against people on the move, used systematically and often coupled with humiliating practices and the threat of deportation and refoulement. They are now integrated nationally as a strategic means of supposed deterrence. The dark side does indeed seem to have taken over. One particularly worrying aspect of the practice is that in the EU at the political level, there appears to be condemnation of what goes on at the ground level, but then does nothing about it. No serious investigation, no prosecutions follow. War is being waged against migrants at the EU's external borders, conducted by border forces and the Coast Guard with the complicity of Frontex, the European Coast Guard. An investigation by Der Spiegel, Lighthouse Reports, Le Monde and others reveal that Frontex's own reporting system was used to conceal pushbacks in the Aegean and to gloss over the agency's involvement. According to the International Organization for Migration, more than 4,400 people have been intercepted and returned by the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, also funded by the EU. That same Coast Guard recently threatened civilian rescuers in international waters. There are extensive reports of widespread and extensive human rights violations in war-torn Libya. Civilian search and rescue operator Sea-Watch recently began proceedings in Luxembourg against Frontex over its refusal to release documents detailing the working relations with the Libyan Coast Guard. Even though finally some measures have been taken to hold that agency to account, recall that in October 2021, several member states urged revision of the Schengen Borders Code so as to allow preventive and deterrence measures. Member States have also provided significant resources to Frontex over the years. It's the EU's largest agency. Its budget has gone from 6 million euros in 2005 to 543 million in 2001 and more than 750 million scheduled for 2022. Murray Lieberman reports its present difficulties in obtaining information because of obstruction and the repression of NGOs and other non-state volunteers. Spurious legislation has been adopted allowing the authorities to curtail seagoing operations. So much of what is done to migrants, refugees and asylum seekers is done out of sight on the high seas or on remote islands or off the coast of Turkey. In fact, many refugees and asylum seekers are now choosing the Calabria route to Italy, which shows that the Greek policy does not work as a cooperative endeavour. A recent report, a feasibility study, courtesy of Elspeth Gauld and Nicoletta Buzatil, reviewed the evident failings of ad hoc monitoring mechanisms agreed by the European Commission in Croatia and Greece. It noted that the expansion of Frontex powers and resources had come at the expense of the fundamental rights of those seeking to cross the EU's external borders. Credible reports of rights violations had been routinely dismissed by national and EU authorities, leading to lack of political oversight and judicial control, resulting in impunity. Taking account of the criteria of independence, an adequate mandate, funds and powers, transparency and publicity, as well as solidarity between monitoring bodies in Europe, it recommending that existing institutions, the Ombudsman, national human rights institutions, and national preventive mechanisms against torture could make up a system to provide effective human rights monitoring at the EU's external borders. And if adopted, such a mechanism would go a long way towards overcoming the obstacles recounted by Murray Lieberman and others. Of course, pushbacks have always happened. The EU-Turkey deal, however, created a containment policy, trapping thousands on the Greek islands and preventing onward travel. Any self-respecting society faced with incontrovertible reports of violence at the border would surely call for inquiry and look seriously at the question of legal liability, asking first who dictates the policy and secondly who implements the policy. More than naming and shaming is called for, and prosecutions and criminal sanctions are needed rather than criminalizing a few refugees who may have steered boats and arbitrarily sentencing them to years of imprisonment. Now, the 1951 Convention is not a perfect treaty, as some would have it. It contains absolutely nothing on admission. It was a proposal which states expressly rejected. It leaves states to cooperate in sharing the unduly heavy burden that may fall on countries of first asylum, hence the admittedly patchwork provisions on response to resettlement and the voluntary provision of funds. States prefer to keep such matters within their discretion, hence the fact that a 25-year-old scheme to reimagine the world remains where it began, its mandatory elements having gained no traction whatsoever with states, just like the 1986 Danish proposal or Graal Madsen's allocations from a decade earlier. In other developments, the EU has proposed regulating through the Artificial Intelligence Act, a medium likely to have an impact on asylum, migration, and border control. In its various manifestations, artificial intelligence may influence decision-making and the assessment of credibility. But nowhere in the proposal is it suggested that protection or international obligations should be factored into its implementation. The approach is risk-based, yes, but with too little attention to the impact on fundamental rights, in particular to the danger of inbuilt bias and discriminatory outcomes. As Alex Alenikov and David Owen recently wrote, states want control over their borders. According to Boris Johnson, it's what the people voted for when they voted for Brexit. But being in control is not the same as closing borders and pursuing arbitrary detention and arbitrary expulsion. Being in control means developing and maintaining legal migration channels and effective asylum procedures. It means subscribing to the rule of law and to respect for fundamental rights. What the public needs is not closed borders, but confidence in government that it can manage migration in all its aspects. But what we see is evidence of failure. United Kingdom and Rwanda Memorandum of Understanding underlines the years of Home Office failure and the hostile environment introduced by Theresa May when she was Secretary of State for Home Affairs. The MOU will solve nothing, but instead will visit hardship on a limited number of individuals, as was the case with so-called offshore processing in Australia. Incidentally, the 2018 Global Compact on Refugees contains some 30 instances of the word access, while more to the point, there is a whole section entitled Reception and Admission. So much for UNHCR's fear of the word. There can be no protection without obligation, without law. Since the time of the League of Nations, it has been recognized that given the breakdown of their relationships with their country of origin or because of external events, refugees have basic needs that must be met by the international community. They also require protection, and the rules of protection can all be traced back to the essential idea of no compulsory return. Before any High Commissioner, any recommendation, any organization, or any treaty, this basic principle was adopted instinctively by those in the League of Nations called on in 1921 to discuss what was to be done for refugees. The idea of no compulsory return reflects a basic humanitarian response to a fundamental human predicament. And the development of international refugee law ever since has put flesh on the bones, even as states have tried from time to time to rein in its development and its scope for protection. In the fourth edition of the Refugee and International Law, published in September last year, we undertook a thorough analysis of the law and practice on non-refoulement, looking both at the recent past and with an eye to the future. And it confirms that the central principle of refugee protection is as robust as ever from a theoretical perspective. Its status as customary international law is indisputable, even among states that have, for different reasons, none of which refers to non-refoulement, so far failed to ratify the 1951 Convention. Moreover, there are several other judicial decisions apart from the 2008 Hong Kong case mentioned yesterday, which have recognized the customary international law status of the rule, including in Bangladesh, with a population of some 1 million Rohingya refugees, I would recall, and in Malaysia, which also has a refugee problem, and in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. In a doctoral thesis written by Brian Barbour, who has considerable experience actually working with governments over many years, the governments of Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaysia, India, Bangladesh, and South Korea, he notes that Hathaway refers mostly to violations of the prohibition of refoulement by states that are in fact party to the Convention. These incidents, he notes, have been consistently and soundly condemned in each case and should be characterized as treaty violations, not as evidence against customary international law. Barbour also takes issue with Hathaway's use of non-ratification as somehow evidence of rejection of non-refoulement. Barbour's thesis challenges the idea of Asian exceptionalism and shows that Asian states are in fact managing refugee protection in accordance with their accessions to relevant international conventions and the adoption of domestic laws and policies and practices. There are many reasons why a state may have chosen not to ratify the 1951 Convention, and none is on record as having objections to the principle of non-refoulement. Barbour also notes that there are pages of anecdotal incidents in which what Hathaway terms non-entree, including pushbacks, border closures, and the like, primarily in countries that are party to the 1951 Convention, together with a few non-parties, but few of any examples of refoulement. In a chapter I wrote in 2014, I reviewed the notion of temporary refuge as a rule requiring admission and non-return to danger. I considered doctrinal analysis, including not only jurisprudential writing, but also the judgments of the International Court of Justice, the ICRC's study on customary international humanitarian law, and the work of the International Law Commission on the identification of customary international law. I concluded that there was ample support for such a rule in light of state practice and opinio juris, including the special value which members of the international community attach to the protection of those displaced by persecution or conflict and to the obligations of admission and non-return. Recognition of basic principles such as non-return nevertheless guided early policy, which was translated into practice more or less and finally into obligations. The notion of protection expanded, But there have always been some regrettable exceptions. Nansen, for example, and many of those who followed him believed in national treatment of refugees in the labour market, but here their reach exceeded their grasp. The question of who to protect is easy to propose, but less easy to answer. It depends very much on who is asking. And seeking to advocate for protection as refugees of this or that group, many necessarily fall by the wayside. National systems of refugee determination, valued by states for their gateway function, are overburdened, over-legalized, and over-judicialized. This is not to undermine or to discount what has been achieved in expanding protection through the courts, but it is to signal that we need to think outside the conventional box when looking at the provision of protection to those in need. If a refugee is someone with a well-founded fear of being persecuted on certain grounds, then what are refugees who simply identify themselves as refugees? What value do their voices carry, and how should we respond administratively to their requests for protection? The role of law has many dimensions when it comes to protection of refugees. Obviously, international legal instruments and national laws and jurisprudence are a very present part of the ever-evolving regime, but the law leaves many questions unanswered, such as the meaning of asylum. Initially, solutions in thinking and in practice were essentially political, and this carried over into the first years following adoption of the 1951 Convention. There is little evidence that it was seen to be a rights instrument, and how it would develop was then far from clear. Certainly the Universal Declaration was mentioned in the preamble, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, providing a useful anchor for the future, but there are few references to rights as such in the Convention. But it is self-evident today that states do have obligations between themselves in relation to many of the instances of international movement, and the implications of refugee status and non-refoulement through time. It's now accepted that refugees and asylum seekers considered as individuals have rights, that refugee rights, human rights. It was not always so. But in my view, there's no going back to a pre-rights era given the evolution that's taken place with regard to the 1951 Convention and to protection more generally. The linkage to asylum, in the sense of a durable solution, nevertheless remains contested. This inspires states to think that protection can be a temporary response to what is, in their view, a necessarily temporary phenomenon. This perspective, although it is belied by experience, encourages states, some more than others, to support short-term responses that become longer and longer and end up wasting the capital of refugees' lives. It would be far better to think and act as if refugees were with us indefinitely, to enable them to plan for the longer term, to acquire skills and to earn, to see their children educated, not detained hopelessly and without hope. Perhaps the major challenge to the international legal regime today lies in the push to externalize asylum. Australia has already done this with regard to people intercepted while seeking to arrive by boat. Many have been detained for long periods in Papua New Guinea and Nauru, while substantial amounts have been paid in compensation by the Australian government for the ill treatment they suffered. In fact, no one has been sent to Papua New Guinea or to Nauru since 2014. But this did not stop the Australian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, the ambassador, misrepresenting the facts when he gave evidence to the House of Commons on the Nationality and Borders Bill. We'll call it lying, actually. Among other things, he had served as the Attorney General in the government at a time when proceedings were started in the International Criminal Court against Australia on account of its practices. Nevertheless, he expressed ignorance of this fact while downplaying the ill treatment, the compensation paid, and the very great costs involved in maintaining offshore detention while hoping for regional processing to eventuate. Although we in the Caldor Centre, that's the Caldor Centre for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales, pointed out these and other errors, this did not stop the United Kingdom under Johnson and Patel from signing an MOU with Rwanda, under which certain asylum seekers will be selected for sending to Rwanda, where their claims will be processed. This will take place within a framework that even the UK describes as one of international obligation, although its understanding of international law and international obligation appears a little shaky if the statements regarding the Northern Ireland Protocol are anything to go by. However, even the UK is keen to insist that it's not acting in breach of the Convention or international law, and is not claiming an absolute right of transportation. Externalization blurs, however, the responsibility in the process of determining whether someone is a refugee. In Australia and in the UK, it was clearly manifestly introduced in light of local failures and to secure electoral advantage. Leaving aside the merits, demerits of the policy, the government will have to take certain decisions with regard to who to send. And this means it must decide according to law, must not choose arbitrarily or disproportionately. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled in the case of SAS that Article 14 prohibits direct discrimination and indirect discrimination, wherever, and I quote, a general policy or measure has disproportionately prejudicial effects on a particular group, even where it is not specifically aimed at the group and there is no discriminatory intent. And it will be for lawyers and advocates at all levels to challenge both this despicable policy and the means and methods of its implementation. The 1951 Convention is most likely the most litigated treaty in the world. Every day, someone, somewhere, is considering how to interpret and to apply its provisions. Much of what is done, of course, is run-of-the-mill stuff. But every so often, a new point of principle will emerge, or governments will seek to narrow the scope of protection, and lawyers, NGOs, human rights advocates, and UNHCR must then take up the case, either for the individual or the group, either for the case or strategically for the good of all. Here we can see the international impact of local case law in contributing to the emergence of settled interpretive practice. For example, with regard to the meaning of persecution or the reasons for a well-founded fear, or in the application of the principle of non-penalization for illegal entry. We see too the impact in international refugee law of the jurisprudence of human rights bodies, for whom the return to risk of harm of those seeking protection is to be avoided at all costs. Faced with the strengthening endorsement of basic principles, states seek ways and means to prevent arrival by physical obstacles, by visas, carrier sanctions, denial of disembarkation, by often spurious arguments of protection elsewhere, that someone else is surely responsible. There is no new treaty, no updated UNHCR statute, and no evident prospect of such emerging. Even as times have undoubtedly changed and the COVID-19 pandemic has brought in opportunities to control the movements of people between states irrespective of their needs. Add to that an awareness of the increasingly protracted and unresolved nature of refugee problems in the world and increasing movements of refugees to where they might find better protection for themselves and their children, and you have the hallmarks of intensified confrontation in matters on which states appear at the present unwilling to commit themselves. States indeed find themselves in a quandary, uncertain how to react and unwilling in general to be seen to cooperate equitably and meaningfully with others. On the one hand, they continue to place barriers in the way of refugee movement, while on the other hand, their own and international jurisdictions insist that a small but important measure of protection, non-refoulement, is available to all who are touched by the agents of the state and who are at risk of return to harm. Somewhere in all of this stands UNHCR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, which states have formally mandated to provide protection and to seek solutions. Whatever Johnson and Patel may claim, protection is not straightforward, but considered in its legal dimensions is the constantly evolving product of a dialectic involving legislative and executive power and the individuals to whom it is applied. And here it is that courts must maintain the balance. Unelected judges, yes, who are essential in any democratic society committed to the rule of law and to fundamental rights and to ensure the exercise of power is not arbitrary. We're looking at a world in which migration has become normalized, and so too have refugee flows. Responding to them needs to be driven by commitment to freedom, respect for human rights and human dignity, equality and solutions. In the threefold spectrum of flight, refuge and solution, the responsibility for protection falls on states and of course on international institutions. But it's also the responsibility of civil society, of us all, to see that the law is upheld in relation to refugees or those displaced further to disasters or climate change, or those threatened with statelessness as a result of deprivation or denial of citizenship. In solutions, the question of fair and equitable responsibility sharing in international refugee law is another area calling out for our attention. In no particular order, here are three areas in which the talents of lawyers and advocates will be called for, and litigation will be in order. First, protection as a right. which is consequential on multiple obligations in international law. Secondly, non-discrimination in accessing protection, considered in the general sense understood in international law, not in the limited sense of the 1951 Convention. And thirdly, the power of the law at large in both its civil and criminal aspects, which can be used, has been used, and will be used to protect refugees. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Goodwin, for your excellent and most interesting presentation, reminding us once again of the difficulties and the lack of protection that the refugees encounter, and the breach of the obligation of non-refoulement, and reminding us once again of the importance of the customary, the importance of the national courts in implementing the international acts. So I thank the participants of this first part of the panel. I would, since we're going to take the questions at the very end of the first session, I would invite you to accommodate yourself to into the public, into the auditorium, and I would like to call the second speakers of today's panel. So Professor Elsbeth Gilt, Professor Stefan Breitenmoser, and Professor Stefan Oetter to come to approach the yes. So Professor Stefan Oetter, in fact, told me yesterday that probably he will arrive a little bit late because he had another obligation to conduct online a PhD defense thesis that he could not miss, so he would arrive at the end. Thank you. So let me introduce the speakers of today. Elizabeth Gilt from the Queen Mary University of London is a Jean Monnet ad personam professor at the Queen Mary University, as well as at the Radboud University Nijmegen. I think I could pronounce it right, in Netherlands. She's also a partner at the London law firm, Kingsley Napley, and she's also a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. Professor Stefan Breitenmoser from the Basel University is a full professor in European law. He has also he has been a lecturer at the University St. Gallen at the Europe Institute of Bonn. He's a member of the Austrian Human Rights Institute, and he's a judge at the Federal Administrative Court of Switzerland. And Professor Stefan Oetter, who will be joining us in a while, from the University of Hamburg. He's a professor of German and comparative public law and public international law, and a managing director of the Institute of International Affairs. He's a chairman of the Independent Committee of Experts of the European Charter of Regional or Minority Language within the Council of Europe. So now I would like to give the floor to Professor Elsbeth Gilt, who would speak today of competition between asylum seekers at the gates of Europe. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Anna, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I do feel like I've been a bit of a ghost wandering through this panel. But it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you so much to the whole of the team and the network for making this possible. I've been given the subject of competition between asylum seekers at the gates of Europe. So I want to make a few general comments about this. And I think the starting place, which follows on to some extent from Professor Recchi, is the gates of Europe. Where are the gates of Europe? And I think we need to think about this a bit. In law, the gates are, of course, the EU external borders. But the EU external borders, as gate places where gate keeping takes place, is divided into the Schengen system, 26 countries, which includes 4 non-EU countries, which are well represented here, as well as excluding 5 EU member states. Not quite so well represented here. So we have a variable geometry about where are the gates of Europe. Then we need to think about what are the legal tools which apply at the gates. And we heard in the previous session a fair amount of discussion about the importance of visas, at least the political importance of visas, carrier sanctions, and closed and open crossing points. I will make one question just at this point, which I will leave for the previous panel, which is when we come to look at how many people are counted as migrants in the world population, according to the IOM, about 6% of the world's population are migrants. And that is in a world where all of these measures, visas, carrier sanctions, closed crossing points, all the policies that you're talking about in this project are applied to manage movement. We have the alternative within the 27 member states of the European Union, including the Schengen ins and the Schengen outs, where you have a system of absolutely no control on movement of persons. 450 million people living in the area. They can all move tomorrow to Luxembourg if they would wish, and are entitled to do so and to receive all the benefits of living in Luxembourg. Of course, the minimum wage in Bulgaria is about 30% lower than the minimum wage in Sweden. Rational choice theory, as has been explained to us, would seem to indicate that there should be nobody left in Bulgaria. That is not the case, as we know. What percentage of the EU population in this completely free system, without any visas, carrier sanctions, closed crossing points, right to move, blah, 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 the whole lot for 450 million people, how many people does the European Commission consider remain more than 90 days out of every 180 days as a migrant in another EU member state? 3.6% of the population of the EU. Now, this raises the question of what is the efficiency and the efficacy of all of these measures which the international community puts into place to manage migration, which results in higher migration than no controls. Now, that is just a question I'm going to pose to you. Why do we invest? I did ask someone in the World Bank this once. Why do we invest so many resources into these fences and walls and visas, etc., when the outcomes are greater migration than in the EU area with no controls? And of course, the expert in the World Bank said to me, well, we're not allowed to say this publicly, but if it were up to us, we would abolish all of this immediately. This is an extraordinary waste of money, particularly for countries which need to be investing in their health systems, in education, etc. That was a parenthesis. I will now talk about closing the gates. As Professor Goodwin-Gill has pointed out, an astonishing amount of violence, even up to death, is exercised in border controls on an incredibly small number of people who are not chosen for who they are, but on whom it falls in a rather arbitrary manner because their boat happens to sink in the Mediterranean as opposed to the other boat. And the legal and moral questions which that places on us are enormous. Why do we invest so much resources in delivering vast amounts of violence against a tiny number of people, and we don't even know if they're the ones we don't want or we do want? Italy closed borders, COVID, to COVID-19 to prevent disembarkation only of rescue ships, a form of extreme violence carried out on the basis of a public health policy, but only in respect of a small number of people. More recently, Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania closed their border crossing points with Belarus on the argument of instrumentalization of migrants. And this idea that somehow violence should be performed on those poor people who are trying to cross, fleeing for their lives, because one state seems to have opened a door somewhere else for them and may be instrumentalizing this in respect of another state. So instead of it being a matter of a discussion between states, violence is performed on those who are crossing that border with the closure of that border crossing point. What about opening gates? What do we know about opening gates in the European Union? Well, we have the 11 April 2017 lifting of visa requirements for Ukrainians with biometric passports. We get on the 4th of March 22 the opening of a temporary protection scheme for all people who were resident on a long-term basis in Ukraine on the 24th of February 2020. Now, we've all heard many tales about the difficulty of long-term resident third country nationals in Ukraine to actually prove and substantiate their entitlement to inclusion under the temporary protection scheme. But the Council decision opening that scheme included them expressly in the personal scope of the scheme. Anyone who has international protection in the Ukraine, from any country in the world, anyone who is a long-term resident in Ukraine, not irrespective of nationality, is included within the scheme. Excluded are students on the basis that they are considered to be temporary, and the best thing for a student is to go home if there's trouble in the country where they are studying. It's what we expect of our children. If our children are studying abroad and a civil war breaks out, the first thing we want them to do is to come home, and we send them money and we put them on flights and we get them on buses to the next place. It's not an unreasonable thing to do. It may not be perfect, and of course there needed to be passage for those students to travel to places, i.e. to Warsaw, to get a flight to go home, but one can see a rationale to it. Unless, of course, going home means going back to torture, inhuman and degrading treatment, or persecution, in which case, of course, they are refugees. How does the temporary protection scheme work? The Commission has told member states over and over again, this is not an application that is made by Ukrainians. This is immediate access to rights. So a very generous opening of the gates, not only to the territory, but also to access to rights, to work, etc. What about gates as places of competition? And here I come to what is the, towards the end of what I was asked to think about. And gates as places of competition is based on the idea that somehow entry into the EU is a scarce commodity which needs to be rationed. So the idea that there are too many of them, what does that mean? How do we understand that? Does that mean that somehow people should be rationed as they come in? Only some people should come in? What does Frontex tell us about that, the logic of that kind of argument? And here I've given you the external border crossing figures for 2020. This was even in the middle of the pandemic. There were more than 93 million people who entered the EU. And what I love about the Frontex statistics is that final 227. This is a claim to knowledge which is ironclad. Frontex knows down to the last 7 people who entered. And that's just like a knowledge claim that Eurostat doesn't even hope to get anywhere close to. More important is 2019, before the pandemic, 304 million people entering the EU every year. That's a much more normal figure. And of course, about half of those people will be EU citizens. The rest of them, well, Frontex doesn't actually know who quite a lot of them are, but the rest of them will be third country nationals. And we refuse entry to 131,439, another one of these wonderful truth claims of Frontex at the external entry, which is 0.005% of the approximately 400,000 border guards in the European Union. That means each border guard refuses about a quarter of a person once a year of entry into the EU. All right, so we're talking about, is entry a scarce commodity into the EU? Well, of course not. Not if we behave this way. How can we possibly claim this is a scarce commodity? We only refuse entry to 131,000 people. There are under 200,000 people who enter irregularly by boat each year into the EU. When I talk about the tremendously small number of people on whom is performed this massive amount of violence, these are the figures I'm basing that claim upon. How many people apply for asylum in the EU? Well, we see that in 2021, it was 535,000 people. This is, of course, a Eurostat statistic, so they just equalize it out. They don't make the same truth claim that Frontex does. So that's for the statisticians in the room. What I haven't given you is the other Eurostat statistic, which I often give, which is how many first residence permits did we issue to third country nationals in the EU last year? What is the average over the last 4 or 5 years? And we issue about 3 million first residence permits to third country nationals every year, of which the largest single category are workers. 535,000, even if we gave all of them international protection, is quite small in relation to what the kind of openness which the European Union has towards third country nationals and the issue of residence permits. So I think we have to be very careful about our argument that entry into the EU is a scarce commodity, that residence in the EU must be very carefully rationed, that somehow asylum is a challenge which we have tremendous difficulty with when we are faced with the EU as a place of competition. I've given you there our outcomes of asylum applications, and of course, if asylum seekers were sensible people following rational choice theory, as has been promoted by some people we have heard here, they would all be applying for asylum in Ireland, because all but about 5% would get protection there. Now, that doesn't actually happen, as we know, and as you can see here. But that is, of course, what rational choice theory would tell us. Where are our first asylum seekers coming from? Well, I mean, like, what a surprise that is, that set of figures. Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis. Protection rates for Syrians are up around 80%. These are not people who we never expected to arrive. These are people who we know are in need of international protection. When we come to those who are fleeing Ukraine, and I've only given you here the statistics for Europe, the EU, I haven't given you the statistics for Russia, because there are about 680,000 Ukrainians who have fled to Russia. But we see we've got over 3 million in Poland. Again, these truth claims. These are UNHCR statistics. We know down to the last two. Romania has about 900,000, Hungary, Moldova, etc. And then it drops dramatically down to about 150,000. Once again, rational choice theory. Ukrainians have entered. They are entitled to go anywhere in the EU under the temporary protection scheme. why haven't they all gone to Luxembourg? Why are they staying in Romania, which is a poor country and which can provide them with few resources in so many numbers? Why are 3 million of them sitting in Poland? Well, that's because our rational choice theory, our way of thinking about it, makes no sense to the Ukrainians who need protection. They're waiting to see if they can go back. They don't want to go to Germany. They don't want to go to Spain. They don't want to go to Luxembourg. They want to stay close to the border so they can go back as soon as they can. They can go back temporarily to check on their property, make sure nobody's broken in, etc., 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 check on Granny who couldn't move, and then go back across the border. And if I was talking to someone from UNHCR last week who'd been up on the Polish-Ukraine border, and he was telling me there are as many people going back as there are coming in. This is an incredibly porous border with people going back and forth because of the normal arrangements that people find themselves in. And of course, there's no requirement to register in the first state of asylum. What does all of this mean in terms of differentiating or discriminating? Well, UNHCR is concerned that the EU has opened a temporary protection scheme which is resulting in discrimination between between Ukrainians and others. We have our Syrians, Afghans and Iraqis, all of which have high protection rates, but vary dramatically from member state to member state. We have a similar protection scheme for Venezuelans in Spain, an automatic national protection scheme. So at the national level, we also have this idea that we are carving out nationalities for particular kinds of protection. And we have a special regime for Ukrainians. And we need to think about, are the justifications over the longer term for differentiating between these groups fully justified, or do we need to widen the groups to include other groups where, on an objective ground, they also are in need of international protection? Thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Elizabeth, for your once again interesting presentation about the entry policies in the EU during the past years and about the openness of the EU towards third country nationals and the different treatment of refugees. So now I would like to give the floor to Professor Stefan Breitenmoser from the Basel University. Today he will be discussing about a common European migration system based on intergovernmental and supranational law. So Professor, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the invitation to come here. And I was considering to ask some questions about developing the European migration asylum system. To ask us, is this negative judgment about the system, about failure, is this correct? Is this to say that this is blocked and we should go on, or is it not that dramatic and negative and discriminatory? I think we are all agreeing about the saying that we have heard it yesterday, today, this morning, that there are quite a few failures and we should go on. And we have to see that since 2015 the European Commission is trying to put forward some new instruments and or developments, and there is nothing to see. We are hearing, but I am not agreeing with all these negative comments and judgments, and therefore I try to look in a different way. First, I am I can say that in the very beginning of the European integration, we had nothing. We had nothing about migration and asylum, and only with the Dublin Convention we had international public convention, and not among all the member states. Only 5 member states participated. And then only with the Treaty of Amsterdam we had this this transfer to the European Union, but it was not integrated in the internal market chapter because of the differences everybody saw, and the internal market was much too far developed. And in the beginning, of course, all the member states acknowledged that there were too many problems of sovereignty, and therefore they didn't want to put it in the same chapter. So in the beginning it was indeed a kind of a differentiated integration, and this is important to say because this would be a part of an answer of me for the future, because there I see quite a few possibilities of going further, because this question of sovereignty still remains the hardcore of these problems. They are not the same questions and problems as in the with economic questions in the internal market, and therefore I thought it was wise to have it in another chapter. But anyway, in the development of the European law, we see then first it was anyway a very successful development with the legal basis, all these directives which were enacted by the Commission, by the Parliament, and by the Council. It was a very successful development until Dublin III. Until Dublin III, with in 2013, and after that, everybody was saying yes, we agree. Dublin IV is necessary because of this discrimination at the southern borders, and the registration only in the countries where people are arriving. This is not enough. And so the communication of the Commission and the proposal of the Commission, you all know this, but this is not going further, and people are astonished because it is not going further. In my opinion, this is not that is punishment. So I see that there are quite a few reasons which are even logical. On the other hand, with the Schengen, the same development in the beginning also, public international law, and then the integration in the system of the EU law, also very, I think, successful developments. So successful that we even have now the very new judgment of the court in Luxembourg. You all know this judgment of 28th of April with regard to the reintroduction of internal border controls in case of serious threat to the public policy or internal security. It is now clear that not as the general advocate was a little bit more liberal with regard to the member states, with exceeding these 6 months duration, the court was clear. No, it must be only 6 months, and only with regard to new threats, then a prolongation would be possible. But then the question remains, what are new threats? There we have still a margin of appreciation. This is in one way a success for the European Union to being strict with regard to this exception of 6 months. On the other hand, we can see that now the member states, know that the European Court here is strict, and they see that if such exceptions they would like to have, the court would be quite restrictive, and so this was a question with regard to the temporary measures also with these 6 months. But they know now they should be, if they are interested in keeping their sovereignty, they must be careful in giving more competencies to the European Union. So this is, I just come back to this kind of a thesis. But therefore, this judgment, very new judgment, very important judgment, it seems to me quite important for this thesis too. So the common European asylum system is in a way yes, going fast, far-reaching. When we are considering that in the beginning it was nothing in this kind, and now we have quite a few principles. We don't want any refugees in orbit, no asylum shopping, one chance only principle. So we have the programs from Tampere to Brussels. We see that the institutions, the organs, the legal basics are developing fast. But of course, the system is not yet finished. And it's the question if it could be finished in a way the Commission and the EU wants. And there we see that there are some contradictions between the member states and the European Union. Also, this is quite striking. The UK is now with Brexit out, but already there we have seen that UK didn't participate in all the programs and legal basics. Also, Ireland is in a kind of is not everywhere a member, and Denmark also is, as you see, has the opt-in and opt-out possibility in this sector. So already now the Schengen Dublin system and the common European asylum and migration system is a kind of a differentiated integration system, and not thought as a unified law in every respect. This is, I think, very important to consider. On the other hand, when the court law of the Strasbourg court is very important, we see that even there are no legal basics or not enough legal basics, then anyway we have the courts in Strasbourg and in Luxembourg filling these gaps and giving important parts for the new integration within these sectors. So the case law, I think it's quite important, and I see that the member states of the EU are following this jurisdiction, even if they are not following the proposals of the Commission to finish the common European migration and asylum system according to the proposals they are on the table. But they are following the jurisdiction, and there we have a kind of a common sense with regard to these minimal standards protected by the courts. But also here, with this very new judgment with regard to Poland, Czech Republic and Hungary, we have a kind of a differentiated analysis to make with regard to these provisional measures, temporary mechanisms. Also here, the court was clear that the principles of solidarity and share responsibility has to be taken in account, and therefore was clear that these three states violated the EU law and this council decision. But this judgment shows to the other member states and to these three states too that if they are agreeing to the far-reaching proposals of the Commission, that then they wouldn't have any or too many possibilities left to decide in these sectors of sovereignty. So this victory of the court and of the European Union is also a signal for the states that when they are agreeing to sign new council decisions for permanent measures and mechanisms, then it's then up to the court to decide, and they wouldn't have any possibilities within these sovereignty sectors. So this new pact of migration, or in English it's called pact, in German package, also there we see a kind of a difference. These proposals of the Commission of 22, in my opinion, they are not even discussed in depth. It's no consensus about the member states. They think some of them, or even perhaps most of them, but not all, that procedures must be faster and improved. But how to do it and how the fair sharing of responsibilities and solidarity has to be to realize this is not clear, and I think they realize also because of this new jurisprudence also of the court, that if they are accepting here new rules, then it's no more to them to decide in practice, but it is up to the EU, And here it's very difficult for them to give up and to renounce to their last paths of sovereignty with regard to asylum and migration. So I come to the conclusion that we know that this is discrimination, but how to change it and how to improve it, this is quite a difficult question. On the other hand, we see that the protection of human rights, minimal standards, is well guaranteed by Luxembourg and by Strasbourg, but a weak framework for asylum and migration management at EU level won't be put or improved by new competencies. Here the member states don't want to renounce to their last competencies. They see that they have to preserve, otherwise they would have to give up these competences and leave them to the EU. This is a fact, and we have heard also today that here the parties in the member states and the elections are here also in a kind of interrelation with this development here in these sectors. Dublin, Schengen is interrelated. Of course, when they are not registered in the first entry states, and on the other hand, we have open borders within Schengen, then we have irregular migration. So this is a kind of a problem, of a contradiction, which has to be resolved. And of course, the common European asylum system should be developed further, but and we see all that the Dublin III revision is necessary, but it's the question how much, how far. And the proposals of the EU are going for the member states too far, and therefore they have now no consensus, and with these new judgments, in a way a success. On the other hand, they make fear to these member states, and they stuck to their competences, and so the question arises how we can resolve this problem. And here I think we have to consider some ideas that of course that we are not able to have a revision of Dublin III. This is not good and has consequences for the common European migration and asylum system, and also for the integration of the EU in general. And that we have no consensus about competences and institutions is also to take in account, and that we have these consequences of the principle of solidarity and shared responsibility is also because these principles and concepts are still too open, not clearly defined, and not clear, and therefore disputed. And of course, if we can help the member states to recognize that they are not losing sovereignty in a way that they are just here at the end to fulfill the obligations and to pay for the treatment and for yes their activities alone. So it would be a possibility to have them still at board and to contribute to the development together with the member states. So therefore also my question yesterday, I think we have now not a pragmatic balance between intergovernmental and supranational law in the areas of asylum and migration. It's a critical of the EU institutions, which is going, in my opinion, too far and makes fear to the member states. And I think that the member states should be see that the EU is ready to leave them some competences, and that there should be also in the future, as it is now, but it is of course now a little bit of chaos, especially then when there are many refugees are coming. So then the whole system, of course, cannot functioning. So proposals a pragmatic revision to write down the minimal standards of the jurisprudence of Strasbourg and Luxembourg, and to have a fair balance of international intergovernmental cooperation and supranational integration. And I think the instrument to have this is the enhanced cooperation, which is in the treaty. This is this differentiated integration, a geometry variable, as was also now proposed by Macron, also by the Austrian minister. I am astonished that this is not more discussed, that here with this enhanced cooperation, some member states will have the possibility to go further and will, as it was in the beginning with Schengen Dublin in the 19th, when not all the states were participating, and this should also be the case now with the developing new instruments, with the abolishing of discrimination, with the stronger sharing of responsibility. So this enhanced cooperation would be, for me, a kind of a key to go further and to have a better common European migration system. And this, I think, we can also discuss here in this circle. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Breitenmoser. We really enjoyed once again your presentation and the close overlook that you gave of the supranational and intergovernmental legal system of the EU, and the proposal that you give of the enhanced cooperation for a way forward. Is Professor Stefan Oether, did he return from his obligation? No. So, well, I suggest if the second panelists are okay to postpone his intervention for the second panel. So now I would call the previous speakers to approach, if it is okay, Juliana, to put some chairs here and to call him here and to start the debate. So we are now open for questions. Do you have the microphone? Yes. Okay. So, please, Professor Gozzini, Professor Recchi, and Professor Goodwin-Gill, if you could come. So the auditorium, please, we are accepting your questions, comments, and you're welcome. Yes.
Well,
Yes, of
I
course.
want to pose my question again, in particular, to Professors Gazzini and Recchi about whether or not controlling migration through government measures is an effective and efficient way of achieving a result around diminishing unwanted migration.
Yes, please. The microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. I am more interested about the management from the beginning through the end of the phenomenon. I am less interested in cancelling the limitations, the visas, the entry, because generally I'm convinced that in this historical phase we need more state in some specific and particular ways than more freedom. And when I say state, I refer to the ability to manage the phenomenon, to provide rights, and especially to provide integration. So my first worry is about the xenophobic reactions, spontaneous, but especially the instrumentalization, the political usage of the weapon of the xenophobic reaction against immigrants. And management is the response we have against this kind of reactions and political usages. For instance, just a final word, the theory of replacement, of substitution of our Christian identities by new no-Christian immigrants, or in the United States, no WASP minorities. We have, that's my humble opinion, we have to take into account this kind of fear and referring to the changing identities and lifestyles of second-generation immigrants. They speak the language of the nations which is hosting them. They marry outside their originary community. They spread in the social environment without keeping refuge, shelter in urban ghettos, in Little Italy, Chinatown, and so on. That's the way forward for management and integration. So when I refer to the presence and the action, the proactive presence of the state, I refer not to compel or constrain what is spontaneously rising in the everyday life of immigrants and hosting communities, but taking a partial position supporting what is already happening, the changing identities of immigrants. For a joke, when I take the first lesson, my students, I provoke them telling them, I want to transform you into migrants. They react in a very hard reaction, because our families are sending us to the university in order not to, to face the destiny of migrants, but to conquer a higher social position and status and so on. Migrants in the form of changing your views, your received opinion, your land of origin, and taking the way through the open world. That's the meaning I give to changing identities. How the migrants are changing through generations in the integration with the receiving societies. So I think we have to learn from immigrants into the practical idea that identities are collective and personal identities are not still life.
Thank you, Professor Gozzini. Does anyone from the public? Yes.
I would like to address Elspeth Gill's question as well. I don't think there is any optimal formula. Much depends on what optimality is defined politically. But still, I think that visas are not a bad instrument to regulate migration. I don't want to demonize visa. What I want to expose is the signaling nature of visas to deter mobility and migration, and making it exorbitant and inaccessible to people from less developed countries, and thus saying no way you can move away from where you are, and which is a message to to turn possible migration into irregular migration. So it's an element of a system that creates irregularity in the global migration system. The title of this event is The Way Forward. The way forward for me is making migration more plausible in a legal way for a reasonably larger amount of people, and therefore preventing all the misery that comes with migration globally nowadays. So visa should be reasonably accessible, maybe not maybe in a deferred way. They could be scaled over time. They could be negotiated between countries. But again, this is the way forward, and visas shouldn't be abolished. Actually, they should be reinforced and made, I insist on this formula, reasonably accessible.
Yes, but then it's the question, who is deciding about the visa? Who is deciding about distribution of people within the European Union? And this is my point. If this is the EU alone, then some member states still say no, and it's going too far, too fast for them. So I agree that we have to agree that there are different member states in the EU, and some are ready for open more and more their territory and to help to accept more and more asylum seekers, and they are also ready for giving more visa. So they should do it. This is a good way that they, as you mentioned it now, have the possibility to cooperate, that they have still the means for cooperation, and it's not the EU making it for them. So with the differentiated integration, we cannot just say visa is too open for all the member states. It's too open. It's necessary. I agree with you what you are saying, but I see that we have with the migration and asylum system, we will have perhaps the same problems as we have with the free movement of workers. Also there we have seen Brexit. This is a catastrophe, Brexit for the European Union and for Europe. But it happened, and we see the dangers with other states with the free movements of. Imagine what would have happened when Le Pen would have won the election in France, and we see some other governments coming behind the mountains if the integration is going too fast, too far, and therefore we should going on, continue with the goals, but leave to some states who are not yet ready to deliver all the competencies to the EU, that they still have the possibility to make these cooperation conventions on their own, and perhaps to follow in the future, but not at once, all together. Here we have just to see that there are dangers for not only for the common European migration and asylum system, but also for the integration of the European Union in general. I agree with all you said, but we have to take care that there are some member states who need more time for their populations to follow. In this respect, I am very happy to give you a very positive example that Switzerland last weekend voted in favor of still giving more money for Frontex. We have a very good discussion. We see that Frontex is a scandal. Therefore, the director had to go. It's a scandal what happens in the Mediterranean Sea, but that we are still sticking with Frontex and continue to contribute, and we are not just leaving. We want to help that these problems are resolved. This is, I think, a very good development after a very good discussion we had. And so also for Switzerland, we would like to participate, but when we are put into an edge and people think that they are not able to decide on their own, but there is pressure by the European Commission, then they say no to bilateral treaties. And so it's in a democratic system as in Europe, in the European member states, we have to consider that some countries are perhaps faster because of their history. Germany and other countries, it's fine, it's fantastic, but other countries have difficulties, and we have to leave them more time to be perhaps not in the first circle, but in a second, third circle, and to join later on to the faster countries, and so we don't have the defeats as we have with Brexit.
Thank you, Professor Stefan Breitenmoser. Is there any other comment from or a question? Yes, please. Could you please pass the microphone to the there? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Julia Mourão Permosa from the University of Innsbruck, and I have a comment and a question for Professor Guild and for Professor Recchi. I appreciate, Professor Guild, your presentation in the sense of trying to show that the problem as it is perceived might not be that dramatic in terms of the flows of migrants and in terms of the fears that are often put forward of masses of people coming from poor countries. But it seems to me that there's also a danger in downplaying the role of socioeconomic factors in, and inequalities in generating migration flows, and also in the role these factors play in the violence that is done against migrants. So you argued that violence is done against a very small number of migrants in a quite arbitrary way. But if we take into account what Professor Recchi showed, it might not be that arbitrary in the end, because violence is only done to those who need a visa and therefore have to take those particular paths into the countries they want to migrate. So, and that decision about who needs a visa, as we have seen, is very strongly based on socioeconomic inequality. So violence of that kind is done against a very specific kind of migrants, those coming from countries in the global south who don't have regular pathways and who therefore need to go through the paths that require checkpoints and so forth. Violence is also done not only on those checkpoints, but it is done in many other ways towards those same migrants from socially deprived countries once they are inside the host countries and are irregular migrants, right? They're the ones who are exploited in the labor market. They're the ones who do not have access to services and so on. These are also forms of violence. So that's, in a way, my comment. And my question to you is there any way in which your project, which I find a fascinating project, takes into account the way in which both violence and border control checkpoints not only occur on the physical borders and through visas, but also inside, ICE raids and all sorts of other forms of control are taking place, of course, also inside countries and not only at those physical borders and checkpoints. So is this internalization of borders, we have talked about the externalization, but there are also the internal ones, in any way something that you seek to capture with your project as well? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I give the floor to Professor Elizabeth.
Well, yes, I think the first thing that I would say to your very interesting reflection is that, of course, if we compare the cost of getting a ferry from Morocco to Spain, if you or I seek to get a ferry, you can book it in advance for about 35 euros. According to IOM, if you can't get on that ferry and you need to take a little boat, which is probably going to be very dangerous and where the staff is not unionized and it's not subject to all of the controls to make the ferries safe. The Grimaldi line is a classic example of a very good ferry service that we use. You will probably be paying $2,000 to $3,000. Now, traveling irregularly is not cheap. So you're saying, well, if these people are so poor that they can't get visas, then how can they afford to take this very expensive and dangerous way to travel as opposed to the cheaper ways of traveling, which are available to others? Then there's the question of, well, who is irregular? When are they irregular and why are they irregular? And of course, we have a tremendous problem in the European Union that we do not have any kind of common definition. And the reason that we don't have any common definition is because the idea of irregularity is extremely unclear. And whether we do or don't want people who are irregularly present at any particular time to stay or not is equally unclear. And I use the example usually of, for instance, foreign students who are following their classes and are permitted under the Students' Directive to work a certain number of hours a week. It is not unusual for a foreign student to be asked by her employer, can you possibly fill in an extra shift for someone else who can't make it this week and do some extra hours. That foreign student immediately becomes irregularly present because she has exceeded the number of hours she is permitted to work per week. Now, it may be that she works fewer hours the next week, but nonetheless, for that period, she has become irregular. Now, I think that most of us in this room and most policymakers would say that is not the kind of person that we want to expel from the European Union. We want to allow that young woman from perhaps the third world or the first world or whatever, anyway, third country national, to get her degree and to have her career. We don't want to interrupt her studies and expel her because she acquiesced to her employer's request to work an extra 3 hours 1 week. We would say that is disproportionate and unreasonable. Then on the other end of the scale, you have somebody who, I mean, the Frontex example, if you read their annual risk assessments, their particular bugbear is Albanians who come across the border. They're not visa nationals. They then work irregularly in all kinds of dubious semi-legal or illegal activities and drive Frontex right off the deep end, as well as the local police, and then they get rounded up and they get sent back, and because there's a visa-free agreement, they turn up again a couple of weeks later. And you have that kind of irregularity, which is really annoying to certain parts of our public services. And between the two, you have an infinite number of variations. So we have to be quite careful. The Council of Europe's Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, which is an intergovernmental group appointed by governments of the Council of Europe states, and is a standard producing body. They produce general policy recommendations. They have one general policy recommendation, number 16, which is on irregularly present migrants and access to basic services. And when the members of the committee were taking evidence on implementation of the general policy recommendations in Germany 3 years ago, this is before the pandemic, they received such credible evidence from the witnesses, both governmental and in social services at various different levels, that 40% of people who turn up in offices seeking assistance as migrants who are irregularly present are persons who, had they received or were they able to receive good legal advice and assistance, were entitled to residence permits. Now, if the ECRI committee considered that the evidence which they received in respect of a country which is as well organized as Germany is that 40% of people who are categorized by one piece of the state as being irregularly present would, with the proper advice, be entitled to a residence permit, that indicates exactly how problematic our categorization is of persons who are irregularly present. I think I'll leave it there. I recognize your questions, but the difficulty that we have is, do we know when we impose visa requirements and we have differential application of the severity with which their rules are applied to nationals of different countries, that we know what we're doing? We are certainly not seeking to discriminate against certain people specifically. We're discriminating on the basis of nationality, which is the only ground, of course, which is permitted under the UN Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And we have the end of the Qatar versus UAE proceedings in the International Court of Justice in respect of that matter. So I'll stop there for the moment.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Cozzini to answer the question, and then we have one question from the public. Yes.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a methodological answer to Julia's question. We all social scientists know that we deal with trade-offs when it comes to data collection. On the one hand, we can have very dense but few cases data. On the other hand, we can have large data sets but rather shallow and dry. What I presented was the case of large data set with relatively poor information. Can we have a best of two worlds? Yes, maybe, with mixed methods. And the way forward for me methodologically would be to have selected cases of visa applications for specific country, for specific origin-destination combinations. For instance, I don't know, what happens when you apply for a visa to, I don't know, to Britain from Nigeria, and follow the process and see what happens in the way, how long it takes for the application to be processed, what extra costs are involved, how easy is to get the application approved or rejected, and what comes afterwards when you travel. I would like to have a number of case studies that substantiate the real life hardship of applying for visas in different places in the world, and the same for the border project. Have some ethnography of what happens at checkpoints in different at different borders, and that would combine a bird's eye view of my data sets on the system of what system of visas and what system of border control with insightful information from selected ethnographies. That's a little bit of a research dream.
Thank you for the answer. Now I would like to give the floor to the auditorium.
Christian Tomashat, I'm going to speak this afternoon, and just a short observation. While listening to this debate, the impression grows that we are really having a political debate. This is about policy determinations. What kind of world governance system do we conceive, and how do we want to shape the future? And we do have some legal basis. There's a rigid systems with stable principles, and European Union with all the directives and regulations and so on. We have principles of customary international law, but there's a border limit, and if we want to push much beyond the state of positive international law, then we are in the political arena. And we have to realize that these are determinations which must be left, finally, to democratic forces. The democratic forces, it's not according to some criteria which have to be derived, I don't know, from the skies or from the United Nations. It's essentially the sovereign people makes determinations. And there, we cannot draw distinctions between good voices, those who favor migration, and bad voices who are against migration. This all has to be conducted in a serious fashion, where all sides have their say. And I think we should simply be aware of the fact that it's not so much a legal debate, but it is a political debate, where everyone should be able to state his or her opinions, quite frankly, with no inhibitions. And there are people who find that too much of immigration is not harmful for their country. This is a legitimate position. Those who favor immigration, and let's look at the consideranda of the Global Compact for Migration, where it always said, well, immigration is a great resource for countries to acquire new intellectual forces, and so on and so forth. Okay, this is also a legitimate position, but there are no predetermined positions. We all have to engage in a deep and very open debate on all these issues, I think, and are we as scholars and scientists, are we the right forum to make determinations on these issues, or should it be left to national parliaments and governments who have the legitimacy to make determinations on issues of public policy? Just to say this impression that we are at the borderline of policy and law, and we should be aware that we are discussing at that borderline. Thank you.
Yes, yes, of course, please. Thank you for your comment and question.
I would just make one qualification. Of course, Christian, I know that you know much more about this subject than I do, but there are limits to free speech. As we saw, the Danish minister, who called for racial discrimination in respect of asylum seekers, was sanctioned by a criminal conviction by her parliament for having breached the Danish constitution. And we know that one of the presidential candidates in the recent French presidential elections had been convicted twice for Islamophobic statements, which were unlawful. So the size of the debate is limited, in Europe at least, of course not in North America, but in Europe, by the legislator, who has stated what can lawfully be expressed. It doesn't matter what you think in your head, but what can be lawfully expressed. Our legislator across Europe has made very strict limitations, and I think we need to bear that in mind. And you, of course, have written most eloquently on this subject.
Thank you. I would like to give the floor to Professor Goodwin, who would like to
Thank you.
comment.
Just a comment on the last remark. The sovereign people is a problem, I think, that we have to confront. How do we define the sovereign people, and how do we learn what it is that they want? Migration is very much a dynamic field. It is a dynamic field in which voices are frequently not heard. Refugee voices are not heard, for example. How can we ensure that they are heard? How can we give meaning to the phrase, not about us, without us? I got it the wrong way around, but you know what I mean. And I think you mentioned leaving it to governments and parliaments. Well, yes, up to a point, but we look around us and we see the messes that many governments have made of the issue. Why? Because of attitudinal positions, because of the adoption of positions which are characterized by discriminatory tendencies. We need to broaden the democratic debate, certainly. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, Professor Gozzini.
I also want to react because I try to be wary of invading the normative space. I really stick to evaluative research principles, but I think we have an obligation as scholars to inform the public sphere about evidence. And I really stick to make evidence known to the general public. And when you see that the public opinion in the European Union thinks that the number, for instance, let's stick to simple figures, thinks that the public thinks that the number of immigrants in Europe is 2 to 4 times larger, depending on the countries, than it actually is. We have a duty to inform the public of how the reality is. Another simple figure. Brexiteers were not aware of the fact, for instance, that immigrants in the UK receive back in state transfer no more than, I don't remember if it's 82 or 86% of the taxes they pay. So immigrants contribute to the public purse in the UK rather than being welfare migrants. So all these information that we collect, that we gather, that we have, should be pass to and contribute to the public sphere in a honest and transparent way.
So, if there aren't any questions? Ah, yes. Okay, please.
This will please everybody. I have an extremely legal question for you, Stefan, about the NW judgment, which you mentioned on the Schengen Borders Code, and the court's judgment on Article 25 about 6 months means 6 months. Now, when I was reading that judgment, I was trying to understand what the court was trying to tell us by referring to Article 72 of the treaty as the legal base for the Schengen Borders Code in Article 25, and the 6 months means 6 months of Article 25 as adopted by the EU legislator. And the question that I want to pose to you is, do you think the court was saying to the EU legislator, you are free to change Article 25, as has been proposed in the December Schengen Borders package, under the democratic process if you wish, and 6 months doesn't have to be 6 months, you can make it whatever you like? Or was it seeking to say that Article 72 of the treaty, unless you go in for treaty change and change that legal basis, limits the margin of appreciation in respect of Article 25? Do you have a view on that?
Very short answer. I think the court, as its duty, applied the Article 25. And if there should be an extension of this delay, then it should have a changement of this article. But he said clearly that the practice of several countries which enlarged this delay of 6 months is not legal. And if you want to extend this delay, you have to have new threats. And it's perhaps also a proposition to the legislature to make definitions of new threats, and not only as we know it in the European law to have these references to public order and to internal security. These are of course quite general loopholes and possibilities for extension. Here he was more restrictive. He was limiting these exceptions, and if the member states think now they should have here more margin of discretion because the 6 months is not enough, then they are free to change it. So this is in an interpretation of mine, and he was here limiting also the conclusions of the general advocate, who was a little bit more open. So yes, I think your question is right. If now the legislature is finding that the member states should have more discretion within such systems, then they should change Article 25. But as long as it's not done, then the practice is to be respected. So I read this judgment.
Okay, I see no raised hands, so I think that we have exhausted the first session. I would like to thank all of the speakers for their really precious contributions, and for the fruitful discussion, and also to the audience for the fruitful discussion that has been developed. It has been an honor for me and a pleasure to moderate this session. I'm really pleased, so thank you very much. And with Professor Stefan Otter, since you were not here, you will be in the following session. And now I leave the floor to Professor Cataldi.
Yes,
Thank
just
you.
for a very, very, very quick information. Now we are going to visit the little museum which is downstairs. We anticipate this visit because we have one report more because we have to have Professor Oethe's intervention in the second part. So now we are going downstairs when there is a young researcher of our university who will be the guide for ourselves to visit very, very quickly this museum, which is a little museum but very interesting. And then we will have lunch in the next room. We will begin the second session 15 minutes before what is provided in the program. So at 2:45 we will be, all of us will be again here. Okay? Thank you very much.